The Liquidation of the Individual as a Critique of Political Economy by Fabian Arzuaga. For Theodore W. Adorno, the historical emergence of the waged worker and the capitalist marks not just the economic roles of the principal classes of modern society, but also heralds the, quote, individual, end quote, as a new anthropological type. Hardly older than the Italian Renaissance, the individual coalesces new qualities of, quote, self-responsibility, foresight, self-sufficiency, as well as rigid compulsion of conscience and an internalized bond to authority, end quote. If, as Adorno argued, the, quote, individual owes its crystallization to forms of political economy, especially the urban marketplace, Marktwesen, end quote, it seems that the dissolution of these forms would augur the same for the individual. With the reorganization of capitalism at the turn of the 20th century, quote, competition in the market economy, Marktwirtschaft, end quote, began to see their coordinating functions to conglomerates of monopoly capital and to state forms, oriented to managing economic crises and integrating the proletariat. These economic changes brought forth what Adorno calls, quote, the anthropological transformation under late industrial mass culture, end quote, wherein human beings become, quote, mere receptive apparatuses, end quote, nodal points of conditioned reflexes, end quote. With these changes, however, it seems that even the faint promise, buoyed by the ideology of the bourgeois individual, drifts beyond all hope of rescue. Quote, the concept of the individual historically originated reaches its historical limit, end quote. For the second and third generation Frankfurt School, the meaning and implications of Adorno's assessment are unambiguous. The individual exists in name only, leaving Adorno to elegize the bourgeois individual as one of its last representatives. While other commentators rightly point out that this liquidation does not amount to a deformation, but to an anthropological transformation, interpretations following Jürgen Habermas have emphasized decline. The dead end of such a, quote, relentless pessimism, end quote, has been understood as the inevitable outcome of the abiding influence of the, quote, state capitalism thesis, end quote, on Adorno's thought. According to this reading, if monopoly capital and the interventionist state effectively abolish the market, the structural contradictions of the capitalist economy would no longer be central for a theory of society. With the market made obsolete, so too the bourgeois norm of individualism and the possibility of its imminent critique. The upshot of Adorno's thesis, according to Axel Honneth, leaves, quote, the individual a helpless victim, end quote, at the mercy of, quote, the calculated interests of the major corporations and the planning capacity of the state organs, end quote. Despite the influence of the subsequent generations of the Frankfurt School on the reception of Adorno's work, such interpretations remain one-sided. No matter how withering or even pessimistic Adorno's remarks may appear at first glance, the movement of his analysis never halts at an abstract negation. In Adorno's words, quote, to think that the individual is being liquidated without a trace is over-optimistic, end quote. Liquidation, quote, does not take the form of a radical elimination of what existed previously, end quote. Instead, individuality persists by being, quote, dragged along dead, neutralized, and impotent as ignominious ballast. Ignominious ballast, end quote. While Adorno leaves no doubt that the, quote, socialization of society has enfeebled and undermined, end quote, the individual, Adorno also claims that within this same process, quote, the individual has gained as much in richness, differentiation, and vigor, end quote. This contradictory status of the individual does not foreclose imminent critique, but demands it. Indeed, as Adorno puts it, quote, in the age of the individual's liquidation, the question of individuality must be raised anew, end quote. The related claim that Adorno's theory reflects the one-dimensionality of the state capitalism thesis and effective revocation of the critique of political economy is equally dubious. According to Adorno, the individual persists in the process of the individual's liquidation because the form of the individual's self-preservation continues to require the human being to function as a, quote, agent of value, end quote. It is through the critique of political economy that we can better track how Adorno's critical analysis of the contradictory status of the individual seeks not to eulogize, but to redeem or rescue its promise. In this chapter, I argue that Adorno's thesis of the, quote, liquidation of the individual, end quote, develops the critique of political economy as a critical social theory. A cluster of meanings present themselves in the liquidation thesis, which can be hewn into three closely related moments within a larger contradictory whole. 1. Individuality as a means of self-preservation. 2. Individuation as a mode of social conformity. 3. The fungibility of every individual. The first two moments elucidate the transformation of bourgeois individuality as an anthropological type. Under existing conditions, the preservation of the self withers and fragments the individual subject, who increasingly conforms to pre-established patterns in an effort to adapt to the exigencies of capital. The third movement, the fungibility of the individual, entails the liquidation of actually living individuals, or what Marx calls the production of a, quote, surplus population, end quote. While each moment appears within seemingly different spheres of social life, the expositional separation presented below is strictly heuristic. As will be evident, these moments of the individual's liquidation are unified by a shared basis in the capitalist form and organization of labor and the subordination of the human being to the, quote, regulative law, end quote, of socially necessary labor time. After introducing the three moments of the liquidation of the individual below, we turn to Marx's critique of political economy to show the continuity between the liquidation of the individual as anthropological type and what I call the liquidation of, quote, actually living individuals, end quote. Well, it will be shown that Adorno sets up this transition by linking fungibility to its social basis in the universal commensurability of abstract labor time. He does not explicitly connect this insight to capital's tendency to render labor superfluous in the form of human beings. Instead, Adorno somewhat vaguely detects this inversion in the pervasive suspicion that, quote, everyone knows that he could become superfluous, überflüssig, as technology develops, as long as production is only carried out for production's sake, end quote. To better substantiate Adorno's insights, Part 2 of this chapter turns to Marx's concept of, quote, socially necessary labor time, end quote, as the, quote, law of value, end quote, which reveals how capital distinguishes between social, quote, necessity, end quote, and social, quote, superfluity, end quote, or waste. This distinction extends to human beings in the production of a, quote, surplus population, end quote, an outcome of what Marx calls the, quote, changing organic composition of capital, end quote. After assessing the contributions and shortcomings of Adorno and Marx on the related immiseration thesis in Part 3, the final section considers how the developmental tendencies in the productivity of labor time suggest possibilities for the emancipation of the individual, which can occur only in an emancipated society, i.e. a society not controlled by labor time, but, quote, in control of itself, end quote. The chapter closes by considering how Adorno's critique of, quote, objectively untrue, end quote, yet, quote, real conceptualities, end quote, discloses not just what is promised by the concept of the individual, but also what can be redeemed from the, quote, real untruth, end quote, of the superfluity and fungibility theorized as the liquidation of the individual. Section 1. Liquidation of the individual. As described at the outset of this chapter, Adorno's thesis of the, quote, liquidation of the individual, end quote, presents itself as an anthropological transformation emerging from the historical dissolution of the bourgeois individual. As capital continues to reorganize the labor process according to the demands of ceaseless self-valorization, what Marx calls the, quote, real subsumption of labor under capital, end quote, the individual proves to be increasingly incompatible with self-preservation. Under the conditions of advanced capitalism, the preservation of the self turns out to wither this individual subject as it effaces its own individuality by conforming to pre-established patterns in reflex-like adaptation. Echoing Marx's insight that life as a simple means to life becomes a lifeless thing, Adorno underscores the stark contrast between the potential of individuality and individuality's disfigurement when yoked to self-preservation. As merely a means and therefore a byproduct of self-preservation, the prevailing form of individuality experiences, quote, the possibility of sustaining one's life, end quote, as its freedom. Such, quote, freedom, end quote, to pursue one's own needs amounts to the, quote, cover image of the total social necessity, which compels the individual towards ruggedness, so that it survives, end quote. Under prevailing social conditions, individuality has been made inessential for the survival of a living individual. Quote, self-preservation annuls life in subjectivity, end quote. The subordination of individuality to the preservation of the self entails a second movement of its liquidation as individuation by means of social conformity. To be sure, the critique of conformism comprises some of the better-known features of Adorno's analysis of the culture industry and mass consumption. For instance, Adorno describes the pseudo-individuality of consumer choice, wherein individuals mistake as their own acts of choosing what really is chosen for them on the basis of the increasing standardized differentiation of cultural products for consumption. Yet it would be a mistake to consider formism as, quote, conformism, quote, merely, end quote, subjective, psychological, or cultural. The compulsion to conform emanates from the form and organization of labor in capitalism. This objective basis comes into focus if we keep in mind that the ultimate criterion of self-preservation in a capitalist society is the individual's, quote, successful or unsuccessful adaptation to the objectivity of their function and the schema assigned to it, end quote. The necessity to seek out and fulfill a function in the social division of labor cuts across the class dimensions of capitalist society, and the individuals must preserve themselves either through the successful sale of their labor power or by acting as, quote, capital personified, end quote, by carrying out the logic of endless accumulation. The reproduction of capitalist society as a whole depends on the fulfillment of these functions, in which the form of social organization reduces human beings to, quote, bearers, end quote, träger, or of objectified social relations. Whether proletarian or bourgeois, individuals, quote, must mold themselves to the technical apparatus, body and soul, end quote. Just as self-preservation remains tethered to the labor process as it becomes all the more subsumed under capital, Adorno consistently explains the hallmarks of conformity as adapting, adjusting, submitting, and ultimately identifying with one's function within the capitalist social division of labor. Marx articulates this objective compulsion to conform most strikingly in his analysis of large-scale industry, wherein the worker must, quote, learn to adapt his own movements to the uniform and unceasing motion of an automaton, end quote, Marx. Adorno extends this analysis by tracing this compulsion from the detailed division of labor in the factory to the social division of labor in capitalist society. Quote, people are still what people were in Marx's analysis in the middle of the 19th century, appendages of the machine, not just literally workers who have to adapt themselves to the nature of the machines the workers use, but far beyond that, figuratively, workers who are compelled right down to their most intimate impulses to subordinate themselves to the mechanisms of society and to adopt specific social roles without reservation. Today, as in the past, production is for the sake of profit, end quote, Adorno. Here, Adorno indicates that not only can the social roles of individuals be deduced from their, quote, individuated function in the modern economy as mere agents of value, end quote, but also their, quote, inner constitution, end quote. The individual must mold themselves according to their social function within the division of labor, while also expressing gratitude so far as this function lasts. Social conformity aims to create a, quote, atmosphere of social contentment, end quote. Just as capital must concern itself with the particular qualitative dimensions of production only insofar as they are relevant for producing surplus value, so too is the worker, quote, required to be capable of the same flexibility or versatility in the way the worker applies his labor, end quote. Marx arrives at this insight by tracing how proletarian labor becomes increasingly less specialized, which means that workers must in principle conform to any specific concrete task assigned to their functions within the whole. So central is the objective compulsion to conform to one's function that it renders all feats of, quote, adaptation, all acts of conformity described by social psychology and cultural anthropology, end quote, as, quote, mere epiphenomena, end quote. In this light, we understand why Adorno chides the conservative complaints about the, quote, mechanization of man, end quote. Such an idea assumes a dualist opposition of individual and society in which the individual is conceived either as a residuum of pure subjectivity or is deformed by social objectivity that remains external to it. Neither side of the dualism grasps the, quote, individual, end quote, as itself a historical product of capitalist society. In other words, society, quote, realizes itself through the interaction of the individuals, end quote, who produce it, while the, quote, substance, end quote, of those producers is itself, quote, essentially, end quote, already society. By bemoaning the individual's, quote, inauthenticity, hypocrisy, and narrow egoism, end quote, conservative individualism, quote, blames the hypostatized individual for his fungibility and his existence as a, quote, character mask, end quote, of society rather than as a real self, end quote. Conformity is not a function of an individual's incapacity or indolent unwillingness to develop an independent or autonomous individuality. Rather, conformity is the concrete condition, quote, it is the concrete conditions of labor in society which enforce conformism, not the conscious influences which additionally render the oppressed stupid and deflect them from the truth, end quote. In short, individuals tend to conform by virtue of the objective threat of being impoverished, ostracized, or even annihilated via forced economic exclusion. Is this, quote, fear of unemployment, end quote, if this, quote, fear of unemployment, end quote, helps explain why individuals willingly participate in the dissolution of their own individuality through self-effacing self-preservation and relentless conformity, the objective basis of that fear brings us to the third moment of liquidation, the fungibility of every individual. As the mutual interchangeability of things identical in kind, fungibility inheres within the exchange of commodities. Given the centrality and ubiquity of exchange in capitalist society, fungibility not only encompasses the products of labor taking the commodity form, but swallows potentially all objects, and to the extent we can call ourselves, quote, subjects, end quote, individual human beings. The fungible individual contradicts the historically emergent idea of the, quote, individual, end quote, as a human being with a unique character and special potentialities. Despite the failure of liberalism to make such an idea a reality, this concept of, quote, individual, end quote, still held the unfulfilled promise that every human being could also determine themselves as individuals up through the mid-19th century. However, the fungibility of every individual, which follows from the ongoing real subsumption of labor under capital, threatens to dissolve what the concept, quote, individual, end quote, promises by making every individual identical, and therefore interchangeable and replaceable with every other individual. In their Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer explain, quote, through the mediation of total society, which encompasses all relationships and impulses, human beings are being turned back into precisely what the developmental law of society, the principle of the self, had opposed. Mere examples of the species, identical to one another, through isolation within the compulsively controlled collectivity, end quote. While the context of this passage concerns the destruction of experience as a, quote, new form of blindness, end quote, its source is clearly the work process insofar as it standardizes and makes fungible not only intellectual faculties, but the workers themselves. This all-encompassing mediation that constitutes bourgeois society as a totality becomes refined and restated in Adorno's negative dialectics as the, quote, exchange principle, the reduction of human labor to an abstract universal concept of average labor time, end quote. Here Adorno indicates that the objective social basis of the, quote, fungibility of the individual, end quote, is to be found in the value character of capitalist production. To understand how such fungibility amounts to what I call the liquidation of, quote, actually living individuals, end quote, we need to develop Adorno's insight with reference to Marx. From the perspective of the valorization process, the individual as wage worker is by definition absolutely fungible. The worker counts only as a source of labor time, the expenditure of which can produce value. As Marx writes, the, quote, labor time expressed in exchange value is the labor time of an individual, but of an individual in no way different from the next individual and from all other individuals insofar as they perform equal labor, end quote. Indeed, Marx adds, quote, it is quite immaterial whose labor time it is, end quote, in the production of commodities. As we will explore in the next section, what, quote, counts, end quote, or is, quote, valid, end quote, is the labor time expended in production in abstraction from the concrete characteristics of labor and the laboring subject. Marx sums up the temporal basis of human fungibility as inherent in the production of value in his Poverty of Philosophy. Quote, one should not say that 1 hour of a man is worth, faut, 1 hour of another man, but a man of 1 hour is worth, faut, another man of 1 hour, end quote. An appendage of the machine, the human being, quote, counts, end quote, only as a source of objectified time, or, quote, at most, end quote, a, quote, carcass of time, end quote. Carcassa du temps. Section 2. Value, validity, socially necessary labor time, and surplus population. Above, we examined the liquidation of the individual from the standpoint of its anthropological transformations as it adapts to the imperatives of the capitalist production process. The centrality of the form and organization of labor specific to capitalism, which undergirds these changes, turned our attention to the value character of the fungibility of the individual as the third moment of its liquidation. In the section below, we continue to trace how the preponderance of labor time over its human basis in the organization of capital begins to explain the ease at which fungibility passes over into superfluity. Although labor time serves as the measure of the magnitude of value, not all expended labor time is value producing. Rather, it is only labor time which, quote, proves, end quote, guilt to be, quote, socially necessary, end quote, that produces value. In fact, a great deal of labor time expended in the production of material wealth can, quote, prove, end quote, to be, quote, wasted time, end quote, if that labor time expended in the production of material wealth fails to valorize value. And insofar as the human being counts as a mere, quote, carcass of time, end quote, capital makes no distinction between wasted labor time and human beings as waste. Within the logic of, quote, validating, end quote, labor time as quote, socially necessary, end quote, a surplus labor capacity appears as surplus of human beings. The liquidation of the individual culminates in what I have called, quote, the liquidation of actually living individuals, end quote, or what Marx theorizes as the, quote, surplus population, end quote. To understand how socially necessary labor time functions as the heteronymous logic that distinguishes between necessity and superfluity, let us recall the peculiar differences Marx uncovers between wealth and value. Whatever its social form, use value expresses, quote, the material content of wealth independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate that use value's useful qualities, end quote. The quantity and quality of use values are neither necessarily a function of labor nor measured by the amount of labor time expended in their production. Value, on the other hand, is the specific social form of value in capitalist society when its substance is labor alone, as abstract labor, and its magnitude is measured by socially necessary labor time. Therefore, value is not measured. Christ on the cross. Alright. Therefore, value is not measured simply by the abundance and quality of useful things, but solely by what Marx calls the expenditure of, quote, socially necessary labor time, unquote. By producing at rates faster than socially necessary, it is possible for individual producers to create, quote, in equal periods of time, greater values than average social labor of the same kind, end quote. The, quote, law of the determination of value by labor time, end quote, which appears to the, quote, coercive law of competition, which appears as the, quote, coercive law of competition, makes itself felt to the individual capitalist who applies the new method of production by compelling him to sell his goods under their social value, end quote, forcing his competitors to adopt the new method, end quote. Yet, quote, this extra surplus value vanishes as soon as the new method of production is generalized, end quote. Since socially necessary labor time is a rate which determines what, quote, counts, end quote, or is validated as socially necessary labor time acts as a, quote, regulative law of nature, end quote, in determining the magnitude of value in the same way as does the, quote, law of gravity asserts itself, the law of gravity asserts itself when a person's house collapses on top of him, end quote. Socially necessary labor time measures not the time of individual producers, but that of, quote, social labor, end quote. However, what counts as social labor is neither predetermined nor fully known by producers in advance. For the private labor expended in the production of commodities to be validated as social labor, the private labor expended in the production of commodities must prove to be a valid expenditure of labor time that is socially necessary. A crucial moment of this validation of the expenditure of labor time occurs in exchange, as the transformation of a commodity's value into a universal equivalent, the money form. Prior to the sale, the value of the commodity as social labor time exists, quote, in a latent state, so to speak, end quote, because the, quote, point of departure is not the labor of individuals considered as social labor, but on the contrary, the particular kinds of labor of private individuals, which proves guilt that it is universal social labor, end quote. Therefore, Marx adds, quote, universal social labor is consequently not a ready-made prerequisite, but an emerging result, end quote. Therefore, what counts as, quote, socially necessary, end quote, is not a product of planning, but Therefore, what counts as, quote, socially necessary, end quote, is not a product of planning, but determined, quote, post festum, end quote, whereby the surplus value expressed in the surplus product is transformed into the money form. While the transformation of the value congealed in a commodity into the money form entails an exchange, value is not constituted by the act of selling a commodity for a price determined by market mechanisms in the sphere of circulation. According to Marx, that which exerts itself in the form of effective demand is ultimately the preponderance of the temporal determination of value itself. We can see this mechanism at work in the validation process. If a number of commodities remain unsold, even though those commodities were produced according to what had been anticipated as the time socially necessary for their production, the estimate can and often does prove to be wrong. The failure of these commodities to sell amounts to a failure of validation, which reveals, according to Marx, that too much labor time was expended on their production. Quote, if the market cannot stomach the quantity of linen at the normal price of 2 shillings a yard, that proves guilt that too great a portion of the total social labor time has been expended in the form of weaving. The effect is the same as if each individual weaver had expended more labor time on his particular product than was socially necessary." End quote. In other words, the labor expended has proven to be socially unnecessary, wasteful, and therefore redundant. If a commodity cannot be sold, it proves not to be a valid expenditure of social labor, and therefore possesses no value despite absolutely no changes to its useful qualities as material wealth. Value is not, quote, Value is not, quote, embodied, end quote, within commodities simply because they are products of labor. Products of labor are embodiments of value only insofar as those products of labor are commodities, useful things produced to be sold. Only by exchange can these commodities prove, gelten, that these commodities embody value. Yet, exchange does not constitute value, but validates guilt, the allocation of already expended social labor time. This process of validation yields a disturbing implication. Insofar as labor power, a commodity after all, remains inextricably bound to actually living human beings, the persistence of mass under and unemployment suggests that too much social labor time has been expended in the production of, quote, socially unnecessary, end quote, human beings. That the sale of labor power provides living individuals with their means of subsistence is in no way a concern for capital in the logic, the, quote, regulative law, end quote, governing what counts as socially necessary. If their labor power remains unsold, such workers are summarily, quote, rendered superfluous, end quote. That is, no longer, quote, necessary for the self-valorization of capital, end quote. We can now understand that individuals face liquidation not only anthropologically, i.e. that the, quote, all-powerful identity principle, the abstract commensurability of their social labor, drives them towards the obliteration, Auslöschung, of their personal identity, end quote. Moreover, capital threatens to liquidate actually living individuals when it no longer needs their labor power. Those who find themselves among the intractably unemployed, quote, prove, end quote, to be unnecessary for capital accumulation. Along with expropriation and exploitation, exclusion crowns the trifecta of the, quote, monstrous objective power which social labor itself erected opposite itself as one of its moments, end quote. In other words, capitalist production increases by impoverishing human beings via economic exclusion. Marx explains this contradiction with the concept of the, quote, changing organic composition of capital, end quote, which holds that capital can boost the productivity of labor by increasing its share fixed in means of production, e.g. machinery, by diminishing the share laid out in the purchase of labor power. On the one hand, capitalist production tends to massively increase the productivity of social labor, that is to say, constantly increasing the quantity of means of production, may be set in motion by a progressively diminishing expenditure of human power, end quote, by applying machinery and large-scale industry to production. On the other hand, this increasing productivity, made possible by the increase in the means of production relative to labor power, makes it increasingly more difficult for workers to find or expect steady employment, i.e. to readily find a buyer for their labor power. The implications of the organic composition of capital for the class forced to sell their labor power are twofold. First, an increasing proportion of the working class tends to be relegated to the, quote, industrial reserve army, end quote, as capital requires an ever-increasing expenditure of living human labor for its accumulation. Secondly, the absolute population of the working class swells, despite an increasing proportion of whom are confined to the reserve army. In the ceaseless thirst for surplus value, capital drives down the proportion of necessary to surplus labor time in the production process. This drive to reduce labor time explains the increase of the population amid the precariousness of waged work, because the reduction of overall necessary labor time means that, quote, the production of workers becomes cheaper, more workers can be produced in the same time, in proportion as necessary labor time becomes smaller, or the time required for the production of living labor capacity becomes relatively smaller, end quote. In other words, the, quote, decrease of relatively necessary labor appears as the increase of the relative superfluous laboring capacities, i.e., as the positing of surplus population, end quote. Although it appears as, quote, overpopulation, end quote, this surplus population is, quote, purely relative, end quote, in that its numbers are not determined by the availability of the means of subsistence as such, but by the social forms of producing and distributing those means of subsistence. Likewise, there is no, quote, absolute mass of means of substance. Likewise, there is no, quote, absolute mass of means of substance, end quote, because the, quote, number and extent of his, the human being, so-called necessary requirements, as also the manner in which they are satisfied, are themselves products of history, end quote. Despite the persistence of Malthusian assumptions up to the present day, there exist no, quote, natural, end quote, laws of human population, and hence, quote, no, quote, overpopulation, end quote. Rather, what appears as, quote, a, quote, superfluous population, end quote, in capitalist society expresses a, quote, surplus of labor capacities, end quote, over and beyond those needed for capital. We will return to the implications of this conflation in the conclusion. First, we need to consider some of the shortcomings posed by the concept of surplus population. Section 3. Quote, the, quote, immiseration thesis, end quote, and the relevance of surplus population. Although Adorno and Marx provide the theoretical basis for the present argument that the liquidation of the individual applies not only to the superfluity of bourgeois individuality as anthropological type, but also to actually living individuals, we cannot simply reproduce without modification their respective treatments of the concept, quote, surplus population, end quote. The term has been laden with the problems of the so-called, quote, immiseration thesis, end quote, which largely concerns the historical empirical refutation of the prognosis of an ever-growing pauperization and inevitable collapse of capitalism. Alongside the development of capitalist production, Marx writes that, quote, the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, and exploitation grows, but with this there also grows the revolt of the working class. Capitalist production begets with the inexorability of a natural process its own negation. The expropriators are expropriated, end quote. Quote, against this argument, end quote, Adorno writes in the 1940s, quote, all the statistics can be marshaled, end quote. Quote, shorter working hours, better food, housing and clothing, protection for family members and for the worker in his old age, and an average increase in life expectancy, end quote. Although it is debatable as to what degree such concessions were won by the threat of revolt or by the administrative contraception of revolt, ineluctable pauperization seemed empirically refuted by the mid-20th century. For Adorno, quote, to speak of, quote, relative immiseration, end quote, is ludicrous, end quote. Likewise, while the proletariat existed, quote, half outside society, end quote, in Marx's time, their integration suggests that, quote, Marx's prognosis finds itself verified in an unsuspected way. The ruling class is so well fed by alien labor that it resolutely adopts as its own cause the idea that its fate is to feed the workers and to, quote, secure for the slaves their existence within slavery, end quote, in order to consolidate their own, end quote. While Adorno rightly emphasizes the process of proletarian integration as integral to the survival of the transformation of 20th century capitalism, Adorno's analyses are not immune to the limits of his own historical horizon. At times, Adorno suggests that the relations of production have superseded and neutralized the forces. The integration of the proletariat has irrevocably obliterated class consciousness, or that the, quote, natural economic catastrophes, end quote, characteristic of the capitalism's liberal age appear to have been overcome by Keynesian state intervention. With the advantage of writing some 50 years after Adorno's death in 1969, we too can marshal, quote, all the statistics, end quote, against these remarks. which seemed to assume the perpetuity of what Marcuse in the mid-1960s coined the, quote, comfortable unfreedom, end quote. Since the long downturn of the 1970s, it has become increasingly clear that the relative prosperity and high rates of employment in the rich countries of the post-war years were much more the exception to the rule of capitalist development. Much like those of Marx, the profundity of Adorno's analyses become evident when he glimpses tendencies that express the laws of motion specific to modern capitalist society, even when they do not so readily appear. An example of such insight returns us to our main line of inquiry. Despite the relative abundance within the developed countries of the 1960s, Adorno continues to adduce strong indications of capital's tendency to render labor superfluous in the form of human beings. Quote, a society which in its absurd present form has rendered not work, but people superfluous, predetermines in a sense a statistical percentage of people whom it must divest itself in order to continue to live in its bad existing form, end quote. Therefore, on the one hand, it appears that, quote, by continuing to live, one is taking away that possibility from someone else, to whom life has been denied, end quote. On the other hand, quote, if one lives on, one has in a sense been statistically lucky enough at the expense of those who have fallen victim to the mechanism of annihilation, and one must fear will still fall victim to it, end quote. Likewise, Adorno could write in 1964, quote, at bottom, I believe that domination expresses itself despite prosperity, that all of us ultimately experience ourselves in this society in accordance with our labor as potentially superfluous. In a way, we only eke out an existence by the mercy of society, and that this deep feeling of superfluity ultimately underlies why our current condition can be generally described as one of malaise, precariousness, and the compulsion for security, end quote. Adorno. Certainly the, quote, prosperity, end quote, of the working class in developed countries is no longer as it once was. Likewise, current forms of superfluous labor seem to be calling into question the system's capacity to, quote, absorb the underlying population, end quote. Nevertheless, Adorno's analysis of the liquidation of the individual strongly anticipates what Hannett calls the, quote, social pathology, end quote, of individualization, which he describes as a, quote, number of symptoms of inner emptiness, of feeling oneself to be superfluous, and an absence of purpose, end quote. Yet, unlike Hannett, Adorno's commitment to the critique of political economy as critical theory provides a way to theorize these transformations in light of the possibility of emancipation, to which we will now turn. Emancipation from temporal domination. From the outset, this chapter has argued that the liquidation of the individual applies not only to the superfluity of bourgeois individuality as anthropological type, but also to actually living individuals. In reviewing the liquidation of the anthropological type, we linked its central component, self-effacement through self-preservation, and the compulsion to conform, to the exigencies of finding a function within the division of labor, which most often takes the form of adapting labor power to capital. In establishing the relevance of labor power for the anthropological individual, we extended the thesis of the liquidation of the individual to, quote, actually living, end quote, individuals as redundant or surplus labor power. Such redundancy can be theorized as a failure of the validation of value, i.e., that the time expended by social labor to sustain the life of labor power proves to be, quote, wasted time. The redundancy of labor, i.e., the, quote, overproduction, end quote, of labor capacity, expresses itself as the, quote, overproduction, end quote, of human beings, as a population relatively superfluous for capital. In this concluding section, we draw on Marx and Adorno to theorize how emancipatory moments continue to dwell in capital's otherwise dismal tendencies. Despite capital's drive to reduce socially necessary labor time, it cannot reduce labor time expenditure as a whole. So long as the capitalist mode of production retains value, quote, as sole measure and source of wealth, end quote, Living labor remains the lifeblood of capital despite its growing superfluity. Since the source of new value necessary for capital accumulation remains living labor, what is rendered superfluous for capital is not value-producing labor, but human beings who do not produce value. Living labor as labor power remains essential for the existence of capital, but such labor power needs only to be, quote, at its disposal, end quote. Disponibel Arbeitskraft, but in a twofold sense, spendable or, quote, available for use, end quote, while simultaneously expendable, or, quote, able to be dispensed with, end quote. As Marx writes, quote, the most powerful instrument for reducing labor time, end quote, for the production of material wealth, quote, becomes the most unfailing means for turning the whole lifetime of the worker and his family into labor time at capital's disposal for its own valorization, end quote. Here, to be, quote, at capital's disposal, end quote, means, quote, overwork, end quote, for one part of the working class, and, quote, enforced idleness for the rest, condemned as surplus populations. However, toil and exclusion do not follow from the technical capacity to reduce labor time within mass production, but from its social form in capitalist society. As capital enlists the, quote, powers of science and of nature, and of social combination and of social intercourse, end quote, the quantity and quality of material wealth becomes increasingly divorced from the living labor time expended in its production. Marx suggests that the specific social form of capitalist society was overcome. The technical basis of mass production could be retained to serve the individual instead of the opposite. Indeed, capital creates the material conditions of a post-capitalist society, wherein the, quote, surplus labor of the mass has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth, end quote. Marx even countenances the emergence of a post-capitalist anthropological type, wherein the individual would no longer be simply an appendage, but a living purpose, what Marx calls the, quote, social individual, end quote. The dynamic of capitalist production prepares the grounds for this transformation because capitalism, quote, despite itself, end quote, is, quote, instrumental in creating the means of social disposable time. In order to reduce labor time for the whole society to a diminishing minimum, and thus to free everyone's time for their own development, end quote. According to Marx, the, quote, free development of individualities, end quote, requires that necessary labor time is reduced to the barest minimum. Hitherto, such conditions have only been attainable by members of the ruling classes. In short, then, the abolition of class society requires that society be freed from a form of wealth based on the theft, quote, theft of alien labor time, end quote. This emancipatory horizon of a post-work society, i.e. one no longer ruled by, quote, alien labor time, end quote, is retained in Adorno's theory insofar as it recognizes that radical reductions in labor time would constitute a world historical shift in social organization. The germ of the, quote, possibility of change, end quote, writes Adorno, is the development of the productivity capacity, quote, which will make human labor superfluous up to a point. The decrease in the quantity of work, which could theoretically be a minimum even today, prepares the way for a new quality to come into society, end quote. Indeed, quote, given radically reduced labor time, end quote, the horror of the precariousness and vulnerability that, quote, forms the individual through and through, end quote, could be overcome. To raise the, quote, question of individuality anew, end quote, as Adorno invites us to do, we consider the liquidation of the individual as a contribution to the critique of political economy. Unlike those of the second and third generation Frankfurt School, who emphasize a one-sided decline of the individual, and the analysis given here uses the liquidation thesis to illuminate the contradictions of the individual in the process of the individual's dissolution. Contradictions can reveal tendencies that point to imminently possible transformations conducive to emancipation. For instance, exchange as a, quote, social a priori, end quote, constitutes a real contradiction in that it possesses a, quote, real objectivity and is nevertheless objectively untrue, end quote. In that, quote, it violates its own principle, that of equality, end quote. By demonstrating that the exchange of commodities proceed both equally and non-equally, Marx not only demystifies the source of surplus value, but also uncovers capital's imminent drive to increase labor productivity to such heights that the measure of material wealth by labor time becomes effectively obsolete. However, as explored above, so long as the reign of production for production's sake retains labor time as the measure of value, the redundancy of labor time expresses itself in the absurd form of the redundancy of human beings. As with exchange, the fungibility and superfluity of the individual have, quote, real objectivity, end quote, that is nevertheless, quote, objectively untrue, end quote. The fungibility of the individual obtains the real objectivity insofar as the products of labor power count as congealed units of abstract labor time. As labor power, the individual is indeed absolutely fungible vis-a-vis the production of value. Indeed, the, quote, real objectivity, end quote, evinced by the fungibility of the individual is nothing other than the spectral-like objectivity of value as it, quote, haunts the space between the real and the ideal, end quote. As Adorno explains, compared to, quote, bodily reality and all tangible data, end quote, the, quote, real conceptuality, end quote, of value may appear as, quote, illusion, end quote, shine. Yet, given the preponderance of value in the organization of production, quote, illusion dominates reality, end quote, as, quote, what is most real, end quote. In spite of the reality of the fungibility of in spite of the reality that the fungibility that value confers on the individual is also untrue. It is also untrue. It is not human beings who are in themselves fungible, mutually interchangeable as identical instances of each other, but their labor power. While untrue, such fungibility is nevertheless real. The conflation of labor power and the human being is objectively rooted in the capitalist form and the organization of labor, since living labor power cannot exist apart from living human beings. Capital has no need of considering the human being attached to labor power as anything other than a carcass of time. Yet this fungibility of the actually living individual, all too real, remains objectively untrue. According to Adorno, if fungibility entails, quote, the complete disposition, Verfügung, of all over all, end quote, it would prove incompatible with domination as the, quote, dispossession of one over others, end quote, whether that, quote, one, end quote, would be the ruling class or the heteronomy of society over its captive membership. Indeed, Adorno suggests, quote, pure fungibility would destroy the core of domination and promise freedom, end quote. Along the same lines, Marx's critique of the concept of, quote, surplus population, end quote, reveals that it is not human beings who are superfluous but value-producing labor. As with exchange and fungibility, the very concept of superfluity retains an unredeemed promise in the untruth of its prevailing form. To be superfluous, not needed because there already exists more than enough, could only be achieved in a society of abundance, in which plenitude exists for the individual as a, quote, living purpose, end quote, instead of the opposite.